the city lights blurred into long, neon streaks through the windows of the Grand Imperial. Exhausted and mentally drained, Naomi Rivers navigated the labyrinthine hallway of the 14th floor. Her crisp white nurse's uniform felt heavy, a stark reminder of the grueling 3-day medical conference she had just completed. 6 seminars, 4 hands-on workshops, and 10 hours of networking with colleagues who possessed far more energy than she did. Her shoulder bag dug into her collarbone, and a dull ache throbbed in her temples, synchronized with the rhythmic hum of the hotel's industrial air conditioning. She fumbled in her pocket for her keycard, squinting at the number embossed on the plastic. Suite 1402. After 3 different hotels in 3 different cities this month, her brain felt like static. She finally reached the heavy mahogany door at the end of the corridor. Perfect. All she wanted was to kick off her shoes, fall onto the plush king-sized bed, and let the silence of the room swallow her whole. She swiped the card, and for a heart-stopping second, the light blinked red. She tried again, leaning her weight against the door in frustration. On the 3rd attempt, the mechanism clicked. The door swung inward with a heavy, expensive thud. Naomi stepped inside, gasping with relief as the cool, climate-controlled air hit her face. "Finally!" she whispered, letting the door latch shut behind her. She moved into the dim, opulent suite that smelled faintly of expensive sandalwood, iron, and something sharp and metallic she couldn't quite identify. She didn't notice the silence was too heavy, or that the suite was far too large. Her eyes were already half-closed as she tossed her bag onto a velvet chair. It wasn't until she turned toward the center of the room that her heart stopped. Seated at a polished table in the center of the room was a man in a tailored black suit, his sharp features illuminated by the glow of a single lamp. He didn't look up immediately. Instead, his hands moved with surgical precision, methodically running a white cloth over the sleek barrel of a handgun. Naomi froze, her hand still hovering over the light switch. The relief she had felt seconds ago vanished, replaced by a cold, paralyzing terror as she realized she wasn't in her room, and she wasn't alone. The metallic click of the handgun's slide being racked back was the only sound in the room, a sharp, surgical noise that cut through the hum of Naomi's panicked breathing. Tae-Joon Lee did not look up immediately. He continued his task, the white cloth moving with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace over the matte black finish of the weapon. "The lock on 1406 is temperamental," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that carried a chilling lack of emotion. "People often find themselves at my door by mistake, but they usually have the sense to run before I finish cleaning my tools." Naomi's legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt, but her eyes were locked on the precision of his movements. She was a nurse. She recognized focus when she saw it. This wasn't the erratic energy of a common criminal. This was the stillness of a man who dealt in certainties. I'm sorry," she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. "The card, it swiped green, I didn't mean to." Tae-Joon finally lifted his gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable pools of obsidian that seemed to weigh her soul in a matter of seconds. He took in her disheveled hair, the stethoscope peeking out from her bag, and the crisp white of her uniform that now felt like a target against the shadows of the suite. "A nurse," he mused, setting the cloth down. He stood up, his tall frame unfolding with the predatory elegance of a panther. As he stepped into the light, the sheer power of his presence seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away. Naomi could smell the sandalwood again, mixed with the cold scent of steel. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just beneath her chin. Naomi didn't flinch. She was terrified, yes, but a flicker of her professional steel, the same steel that kept her calm during cardiac arrests, sparked in her wide eyes. She looked him directly in the face, refusing to tremble. A ghost of a smirk touched Tae-Joon's lips. "You aren't begging. Why?" "Would it change anything?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Tae-Joon let his hand drop, his intensity shifting from lethal to intrigued. He turned his back to her, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the rain-slicked city. "Usually, a witness to my private time is a liability that must be removed. But a woman who looks at a gun and a dead man's eyes without screaming, that is a rarity. He turned back, his expression resetting into an icy mask of authority. You will stay here tonight, Miss Rivers. You'll find the couch in the foyer comfortable enough. My men are in the hall. If you try to leave, they won't be as interested in your courage as I am. In the morning, when my business is concluded, we will see if you are as good at keeping secrets as you are at holding your ground. Naomi realized then that the door behind her wasn't just a barrier to her room. It was the threshold to a world she was no longer allowed to leave. The silence of the hotel suite was shattered just after 3:00 a.m. by a frantic, heavy pounding on the door. Naomi, who had been drifting into a restless sleep on the velvet sofa, jolted upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tae-Joon appeared from the shadows of the master bedroom instantly. He was no longer wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were lean and corded with muscle. He didn't look at Naomi as he unlatched the door. 2 men rushed in, dragging a third between them. The scent of sandalwood was instantly overwhelmed by the metallic, cloying stench of fresh blood. Put him on the table, Tae-Joon commanded, his voice like cracking ice. The injured man was young, barely 20, his face ashen and slick with cold sweat. A dark, spreading stain saturated the side of his expensive leather jacket, and his breaths were coming in ragged, wet gasps. The 2 men who had brought him in looked at Tae-Joon with desperation. The hospital is crawling with police, boss. We couldn't take the risk. Tae-Joon turned his head slowly, his obsidian eyes locking onto Naomi. He didn't say a word, but the challenge in his gaze was deafening. He was waiting to see if the courage he had admired earlier was merely shock, or if it was something he could use. Naomi's breath hitched. She saw the blood dripping onto the polished floor, heard the rhythmic thump-thump of the boy's failing heart in the way his jugular vein flickered. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to stay in the shadows, to remain a witness and nothing more. If she stepped forward, she wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was an accomplice. She would be crossing a line that no medical board would ever forgive. But then the boy groaned, a thin, haunting sound of pure agony, and the nurse in her took over. The hero complex she had tried to suppress for years surged to the surface, overriding the icy fear in her veins. Get him out of that jacket, Naomi snapped, her voice startlingly loud in the tense room. She didn't wait for permission. She surged forward, her hands already reaching for her shoulder bag. She ripped open the Velcro straps, pulling out her trauma shears and a vacuum-sealed pack of gauze. The mafia soldiers hesitated, looking to Tae-Joon. Do what she says, Tae-Joon ordered, his voice low and dangerous. Naomi knelt beside the table, her white uniform quickly blooming with crimson smears as she worked. She didn't look at the guns or the monsters standing around her. She only looked at the wound, a jagged entry point just below the ribs. I need light, boiling water, and every clean towel in this suite, she commanded, her fingers pressing firmly against the artery to stem the flow. She looked up, her eyes meeting Tae-Joon. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. In this moment, in this square foot of space, she was the one with the power of life and death. Now. Tae-Joon watched her, a slow, predatory fascination lighting his features as he realized he hadn't just captured a nurse. He had found a warrior. The sun rose over the city not with a glow, but with a cold, gray light that filtered through the floor-to-ceiling sheer curtains of the Grand Imperial's royal suite. Naomi stood by the glass, her reflection a ghost against the backdrop of the waking skyline. She was no longer wearing her blood-stained nurse's uniform, a silk robe, expensive and heavy, now draped over her shoulders, part of a collection of luxury essentials that had appeared in the suite while she slept a few hours of fitful, dreamless sleep. The young man she had operated on was gone, moved to a secure location by Tae-Joon's silent, efficient shadows. The only evidence of the night's violence was the faint, lingering scent of antiseptic and the dark spot on the rug where the table had once stood. Naomi turned as the heavy double doors clicked open. Tae-Joon entered, looking as though he hadn't spent the night watching a man nearly die. He was perfectly tailored, his dark suit crisp, his expression the same unreadable mask of calm. Behind him, a cart was wheeled in by a waiter who kept his eyes fixed strictly on the floor. "Breakfast," Tae-Joon said, gesturing to the spread of smoked salmon, fresh fruit, and coffee that smelled of a world far removed from hospital cafeterias. "You saved a life tonight, Naomi. You should eat." "I want to go home, Tae-Joon," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I have a flight. I have a job. My shift starts tomorrow evening." Tae-Joon poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising in a delicate swirl. He didn't look up. "The silent tigers are not known for their forgiveness. You treated a man they intended to kill. They saw your face, Naomi. If you walk out of this hotel, you won't make it to the airport." He finally met her gaze, and for a moment the obsidian coldness softened into something more complex, something that looked dangerously like concern. "You are safe here. This floor is monitored. My men are at every exit. You have everything you could possibly need." Naomi walked toward the door, her heart beginning to thud. She reached for the handle, but before she could touch it, the lock engaged with a soft, electronic chirp. She looked back at him, her chest tightening. "You aren't protecting me. You're holding me." "The distinction is irrelevant if the result is that you stay alive," he replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. She looked around the room, at the gold-leafed moldings, the Egyptian cotton, the original oil paintings. It was a masterpiece of opulence, a sanctuary designed for a queen. But as she saw the shadow of a guard pass by the frosted glass of the door, the truth settled in her gut like lead. The silk was soft, and the walls were beautiful, but the bars were still there. She was no longer just a nurse who had made a mistake. She was a prized asset in a war she didn't understand, locked inside a golden cage with the most dangerous man she had ever met. The velvet silence of the suite was broken only by the rhythmic click of a lighter. Tae-Joon sat by the fireplace, the orange glow carving deep shadows into the sharp planes of his face. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at an old, faded photograph he had pulled from a concealed pocket of his wallet. Naomi approached tentatively, the silk of her robe whispering against the marble floor. She sat in the armchair opposite him, keeping a respectful distance, yet drawn to the sudden vulnerability in his posture. The predatory energy that usually radiated from him had dimmed, replaced by a heavy, ancient exhaustion. "My father didn't choose this life because he was cruel," Tae-Joon began, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't look up, but he held the photo out so Naomi could see. It was a picture of a young man in a simple laborer's outfit, holding a laughing toddler. "He chose it because he was hungry. We were immigrants in a city that wanted our labor but loathed our presence. When the local gangs burned his shop because he couldn't pay for protection, he realized that being a good man was a luxury he couldn't afford if he wanted me to survive." Naomi looked from the photo to the man in the tailored suit. She saw the lineage of survival written in the set of his jaw. "He taught me that blood is the only currency that never devalues," Tae-Joon continued, finally meeting her eyes. The obsidian depth was gone, replaced by a raw, haunting clarity. "I took over when I was 24, after I watched him die in a rainy alley not unlike the one you walked through to get here. I didn't want the throne, Naomi. I wanted the power to make sure no one could ever touch my family again, but the throne has a way of fusing to your skin." He reached out, his thumb tracing the rim of his glass. "You see a monster cleaning a gun, and you aren't wrong. But that monster is the only thing standing between the people I care about and the void. Last night when you saved that boy, you saved my nephew, the last of my father's blood." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. Her medical training had taught her to see patients as biological puzzles to be solved, but Tae-Joon was a moral puzzle she couldn't quite wrap her mind around. He was a man built of scars and armor, a protector who had become the very thing he once feared. "You're a healer," he said softly, standing up and walking toward her. He stopped just close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from him. "You fix what is broken, but some things, Naomi. Some things are broken so deeply that they become a new shape entirely." As he looked down at her, Naomi didn't see the mafia boss. She saw a boy who had never been allowed to stop fighting. For the first time, her fear wasn't of what he might do to her, but of the heavy, lonely world he carried on his shoulders, and the terrifying realization that she was starting to want to help him carry it. The golden cage began to feel less like a prison and more like a sanctuary as the days bled into weeks. Tae-Joon did not ask Naomi to compromise her ethics. Instead, he brought the world to her. It started with a young woman, no older than Naomi, who arrived at the suite trembling, clutching a feverish toddler to her chest. She was the wife of one of the men who stood guard at the elevators, a man Naomi had only known as a silent, intimidating shadow in a suit. Naomi's transition from prisoner to healer was seamless. When she took the child into her arms, the professional mask she had worn for years at the hospital slid back into place. She worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency, diagnosing the ear infection and administering the medicine Tae-Joon had procured with a single phone call. As the mother's panic subsided into tearful gratitude, Naomi felt a shift in the atmosphere of the hotel floor. Word spread through the silent ranks of Tae-Joon's organization. The boss's woman wasn't just a trophy or a witness, she was a life giver. Soon, the luxury suite became an impromptu clinic for the families who existed in the cracks of the city's underworld, the people who couldn't go to public hospitals for fear of being linked to the syndicate. Naomi treated elderly mothers with chronic hypertension, siblings with jagged cuts from neighborhood scuffles, and pregnant wives who had never seen an ultrasound. In their eyes, she saw the same reflection she had seen in the photo of Tae-Joon's father. People doing the best they could in a world that offered them no safety net. Tae-Joon often watched from the doorway, a silent sentinel leaning against the mahogany frame. He saw the way his hardened soldiers bowed their heads with genuine respect when they passed her in the hall. He saw how the heavy, oppressive fear that usually followed him seemed to dissipate whenever Naomi entered a room. She was healing the spirit of his house as much as the bodies of his men. One evening, after the last patient, a grizzled bodyguard with a recurring shoulder injury, had left, Naomi sat at the polished table, cleaning her instruments. Tae-Joon approached and placed a heavy velvet box in front of her. Inside was a stethoscope, custom-made, its chest piece plated in understated matte gold. "My men used to fear for their lives every time they came to this floor," he said softly, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. The touch was no longer the claim of a captor, but the acknowledgement of an equal. "Now they fear for yours. You've given them something I never could, Naomi. You've given them hope that they aren't just tools of violence." Naomi looked up at him, her heart aching with a complex, terrifying warmth. She was still trapped in a world of shadows, but as she looked at the stethoscope, a tool of her trade reimagined for this dark kingdom, she realized she was no longer just surviving the mafia boss. She was changing him. The atmosphere in the Grand Imperial shifted from the quiet hum of a sanctuary to the oppressive stillness of a tomb. For 3 days, the hotel had been under a complete lockdown. Tae-Joon had explained the stakes: a peace summit, a rare and fragile gathering of the city's most powerful syndicates intended to redraw the boundaries of the underworld without further bloodshed. Naomi watched from the mezzanine as the lobby filled with men in sharp suits who moved with the coordinated lethargy of vipers. Among them, the silent tigers were the easiest to spot. They lacked the weary discipline of Tae-Joon's men, carrying instead an air of jagged, hungry ambition. Tae-Joon had spent the morning in his study, his face a mask of granite. Before leaving for the ballroom, he had gripped Naomi's hand, his thumb tracing the gold plating of her new stethoscope. "Stay in the suite," he had whispered, his voice like a vow. "Do not open the door for anyone but me." The explosion didn't sound like it did in the movies. It wasn't a roar. It was a sharp, bone-shaking crack that shattered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom 3 floors below. The piece was gone in a heartbeat. Naomi was thrown against the sofa as the hotel's backup generators kicked in, bathing the suite in a haunting, flickering crimson light. Screams began to rise from the atrium, not just the shouts of fighting men, but the high-pitched panic of hotel staff and guests caught in the crossfire. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire began to echo through the vents, growing closer with every passing second. She scrambled to the door, her fingers hovering over the electronic lock, but stopped when she heard the heavy, wet sound of a body hitting the mahogany on the other side. A muffled groan followed, one she recognized. It was Min-ho, the young guard she had treated for a fever just days prior. There on the floor, a voice screamed from the hallway, followed by the staccato burst of an automatic weapon. Naomi's world narrowed to the space of that room. The silent tigers hadn't come to negotiate, they had come to decapitate the leadership. The golden cage was now a kill box. She rushed to her medical bag, her hands moving with the frantic precision of a trauma nurse, packing gauze, hemostats, and morphine. She didn't know if Tae-Joon was alive, but she knew the air smelled of ozone and copper. Suddenly, the suite door shuddered under a massive blow. The electronic lock hissed and sparked as it was bypassed. Naomi retreated toward the master bedroom, her heart a deafening drum, just as the heavy wood splintered inward. Through the smoke and the strobe of the red emergency lights, she saw the silhouette of a man. It wasn't Tae-Joon. The intruder stepped forward, his face obscured by a tactical mask, his weapon leveled at her chest. The peace hadn't just been broken. It had been slaughtered, and Naomi was the last witness left standing. The thunder of the breach echoed through the suite, but it was the silence that followed, the chilling, tactical silence of professionals, that made Naomi's blood run cold. Just as the masked intruder stepped into the flickering red light of the bedroom, a shadow detached itself from the walk-in closet. Tae-Joon moved like a ghost, his blade finding the gap in the assassin's vest before the man could even level his weapon. But as the intruder fell, a second burst of gunfire erupted from the hallway, catching Tae-Joon in the shoulder and side. He grunted, the sound raw and guttural as he fired back with his free hand, clearing the doorway just long enough to slam the reinforced safe room door shut. The heavy steel bolts engaged with a final, echoing thunk, sealing them in a small, sterile bunker hidden behind the master wardrobe. Tae-Joon collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. The crisp white of his dress shirt was rapidly disappearing beneath a tidal wave of crimson. Naomi was on her knees beside him in a heartbeat, her hands moving with the frantic, automatic precision of the trauma unit. "Tae-Joon, look at me," she commanded, her voice a sharp blade of authority that cut through his mounting shock. "Stay with me." The safe room was dimly lit by emergency floor strips, providing just enough light for her to see the damage. It was bad. The bullet in his side had likely nicked the hepatic artery. He was hemorrhaging internally. She looked around the small room. It was stocked with water, gold bars, and encrypted servers, but no medical supplies. All she had was the small bag she had managed to grab. "I have to go in," she whispered, more to herself than him. "I have to find the bleeder." "Naomi," he wheezed, his fingers weakly curling around her wrist. "Just stay down, they can't get through the door." "If I stay down, you die," she snapped, already tearing his shirt open. She didn't have a cautery tool. She didn't have an assistant. She had a pair of trauma shears, a bottle of high-proof whiskey from the safe room's small bar, and the gold-plated stethoscope around her neck. She poured the alcohol over her hands and his open wound, the stinging scent of spirits filling the cramped space. Tae-Joon's body jolted, his head slamming back against the wall, but he didn't scream. He simply watched her, his obsidian eyes fixed on her face as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. With a steady hand that defied the chaos outside the steel door, Naomi began. She used her shears to widen the entry point, her fingers disappearing into the heat of his body to find the source of the flow. The muffled sound of explosions continued to vibrate through the floorboards, but inside the safe room, the world had shrunk to the space between her hands and his heartbeat. Every time his pulse flickered, she adjusted her pressure, her mind a focused map of anatomy and iron will. She was no longer a nurse in a golden cage. She was a surgeon in a war zone, fighting to keep the darkness from claiming the man who had become her world. The silence following the surgery was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, labored whistle of Tae-Joon's breathing. Naomi sat on the cold floor, her hands stained to the elbows, her eyes fixed on the heavy steel door. The external monitors in the safe room flickered back to life, grainily revealing the carnage in the suite outside. Through the smoke, she saw a figure enter the room. It was Kaito, Tae-Joon's second-in-command, the man who had personally vetted the security for the summit. He wasn't moving with the urgency of a rescue. He moved with the entitlement of a successor. Naomi watched the screen as Kaito stepped over the bodies of his own fallen brothers, his expression one of bored indifference. He leaned down, picking up the gold-plated stethoscope Naomi had dropped in the struggle, turning it over in his gloved hand with a sneer. "Check the safe room," Kaito's voice came through the comms, cold and clear. "If he's alive, finish it. If the nurse is with him, make it look like she did it. A tragic crime of passion from a frightened captive." Tae-Joon's eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain but sharpening as he heard the betrayal through the speakers. He tried to reach for the handgun on the floor, but his fingers lacked the strength to curl around the grip. He looked at Naomi, a silent apology written in the hollows of his face. He was prepared to die, but he was devastated that he had brought her into the path of a snake he had raised himself. Naomi felt a surge of cold, focused fury that eclipsed her fear. She realized Kaito didn't know the safe room's internal systems were still recording to an off-site cloud, a system Tae-Joon had mentioned weeks ago during one of their late-night talks. "He's coming for the door," Tae-Joon rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "Let him," Naomi whispered. She scrambled to the primary server terminal, her fingers flying across the touchscreen. She didn't know how to fight with a gun, but she knew how to manage a crisis. Using the administrator bypass Tae-Joon had shared with her, just in case. She patched the safe room's live feed, and the audio of Kaito's orders, directly into the personal devices of every loyal captain currently fighting in the lower floors. On the monitor, she saw Kaito freeze as his own phone began to chime, followed by the phones of the men standing behind him. The confusion on his face turned to sheer terror as he realized his treachery had been broadcast to the entire syndicate. The sounds of gunfire outside shifted. The loyalists were no longer fighting the tigers. They were coming for the traitor. Naomi turned back to Tae-Joon, taking his hand in hers. The hero complex that had once been her flaw had become their greatest weapon. She had fixed the wound in his side, and now she had cut out the cancer in his organization. She wasn't just his nurse anymore. She was the reason his empire still stood. The Grand Imperial's penthouse had been scrubbed of its copper scent and replaced with the fragrance of fresh lilies and expensive ink. Sunlight, now warm and golden, flooded the room where Naomi had once been a frightened captive. Tae-Joon stood by the window, his silhouette no longer predatory, but poised. The sling was gone from his arm, though a slight stiffness in his shoulder remained, a permanent souvenir of the night the healer had saved the executioner. On the polished mahogany table lay a thick stack of legal documents, their headers embossed with a new seal, the Rivers-Lee Medical Foundation. "It's a massive risk," Tae-Joon said, his voice regaining its rich, commanding timbre. He turned to face Naomi, who was dressed in a sleek, professional suit that matched the newfound fire in her eyes. "Moving the syndicate's assets into legitimate health care, it leaves us vulnerable to the law in ways the shadows never did." Naomi walked toward him, her footsteps confident on the marble. She reached out, adjusting his lapel with hands that no longer trembled. "The shadows were killing you, Tae-Joon. They were killing everyone you loved. This foundation isn't just a front, it's a bridge. We're going to provide the care your families need without the blood debt that usually comes with it." Tae-Joon took her hand, pressing a firm kiss to her knuckles. The obsidian depth of his eyes was now filled with something Naomi hadn't seen in that first terrifying encounter. Peace. He had spent his life building a cage to protect his people. But Naomi had shown him how to build a home. "You're no longer my nurse, Naomi," he whispered, pulling her into the curve of his arm. "And you're certainly not my prisoner. You are the architect of what comes next." Outside, the city hummed with its usual indifference, unaware that the most feared man in the underworld was surrendering his weapons for a different kind of power. As Naomi looked down at the documents, she saw her name listed as the chief of medicine and Tae-Joon as the chairman. They were bound together now, not by a mistaken hotel keycard or a debt of blood, but by a vow to heal a world that had tried so hard to break them. The golden cage was open, but Naomi didn't fly away. She stayed by his side, ready to navigate the gray areas of their new life, knowing that as long as they had each other, the light would always find a way through the cracks. It wasn't a perfect world, and it certainly wasn't a safe one, but as she leaned her head against his shoulder, she knew it was finally theirs.